Hello ECED 2360 students. I hope everyone had a great week last week. So I am making this video to walk you through the last two parts of our inclusive practices fieldwork. And remember, this is going to take the place of us being in the classroom and doing observations. So this is very important. This is actually a key assessment in the accreditation program for this early childhood program that you are enrolled in. So when we talk about inclusive strategies, right, we want to think about it specifically supporting exceptional children. So if we go back and kind of recap, the purpose of the assignment is really to deepen your understanding of exceptional children in an early childhood classroom. And when we say young children, early childhood, it's age 0 to 8, right, birth to 8. So you had to pick a persona. Now remember, this is different than the case study child. So this persona, you had to familiarize yourself with that child's disability, their challenges, see if they were an English language learner. So really figuring out what their exceptionality was and defining that, but also going a step further and looking at their developmental and learning needs. So you were supposed to do multiple parts. The first part really being you were to research, right? And within that research of this exceptional child from the persona, you were writing a 1 to 2 page summary about that child's challenges, their environmental impacts, implications for practice, unique characteristics, and you were going to sum that all up, right? That was the very first part that you were doing. So you remember, this key assessment is addressing many NAEYC professional preparation standards and competencies. So it's going to address Standard 1, Standard 3, Standard 4, and Standard 6. So as I mentioned, the first part was research and summary. This is the main component of starting out this project. And as I mentioned before, this needs to be a running document, so you can keep this all on the same Word document. The second part, part 2, was where you had to create an informal observation assessment tool. So this was allowing you to really look at it from a parent's perspective. How are you going to communicate your findings about the child's development, their learning, their implications for practice of teaching in the classroom, interactions? You had to create some kind of observation assessment tool. Now remember, this is different than a formal one. This is informal. So these could be things like anecdotal notes. It could be rating scales, checklists. You were to create this. And then you were to answer questions in 2 sections after that. You were going to look at how would you utilize this observation assessment, and then how would you use it to collaborate, right? So you were answering those set of sections here on 2 and 3. There is a video on the course homepage that goes and walks you through part 1 and part 2 of this inclusive practices fieldwork. So please make sure you go back and watch that. So moving on, I did a separate video going over parts 3 and 4. So let's recap. Part 3 was how do we foster those positive relationships and interactions? And when we talk about this, it not only needs to be child-focused, right, which is how you interact with the child, but thinking about how the child interacts with their peers, right, and building that positive relationship with the child and the family and with the staff as well. So thinking about these guiding questions, you were going to look at that. And this is going to allow you to gain a deeper understanding of fostering positive relationships. And what does that look like? So you had to answer these sets of questions here on part 3. Part 4 is where you had to create a play-based learning activity. Now remember, this activity is going to be designed for you to meet the child's learning needs, right? So it had all the components here. There was actually a template for you to follow. On this section here, the template's at the bottom of this assignment, but this was just giving you an indication in each section what I wanted. So you were to label it and set it up this way. In the template, you just were to fill it out. So you were going to give a title to the activity, look at the specific target age group from your child persona. Look at the Tennessee ELDs or state standards. What were those? What is your objective from this play-based learning activity? What materials will you need? And giving you really description and detailed step-by-step of the actual activity. How will you introduce it to the child? How will it be conducted? How will you conclude this activity? What were some teaching strategies you might implement? Any ideas for extension of this activity? And then assessment. How will you know that the objectives have been met? So, as I mentioned here, the play-based activity template is at the end of this document. So now we move into this part of the video, parts 5 and 6. So let's first look at part 5. Part 5 is where you're going to advocate for inclusive practices. So that's actually going along with our NAEYC professional standards, where you're going to identify and involve yourself with early childhood field and serve as informed advocate for young children, families, and professions. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, you're going to do that through this plan in part 5. So you're going to create what we call an advocacy plan. And this is where you're going to use a tool, basically like a structured framework, for advocating for inclusive practices. Now, when we're talking about this, we want this to make a positive impact in educational setting as well as our community. So it's important for you to consider your child persona, right? Look at the child's unique experiences and needs, their exceptionality. So what's their disability? And how can we effectively enhance the outcomes and the educational experiences? So one of the ways we do this is advocating, right? So I actually have a template here, and you should follow the plan as it is here. Okay, so there's a template, again, provided at the end of this document. In this section, I'm going to walk you through what I want in each section of the advocacy plan. So the first part is introduction. This is where you're going to explain the importance of advocating for children who have special needs, right, in an early childhood environment. So we want to be able to create an environment where all children feel welcome and supported. So you're going to introduce your advocacy plan, thinking specifically about how this plan is going to help that child with those certain special needs. Goals and objectives. So this is really where you're going to simply list your goals for this plan. Remember, when you're looking at goals for an advocacy plan, it's important for you to look at equal access to resources that really pertain to that child's disability or exceptionality. What would be some opportunities for that children or all children who have a disability that fosters a classroom culture, right? So looking at those efforts, like what do you hope to gain from this advocacy plan? What are your goals? What are you trying to put out there to the community about this children who have this disability? The next one is assessment and evaluation. Anytime you do any sort of plan, especially an advocacy plan, you have to make sure that your plan is effective. So how do we do this? One of the ways we do this with the advocacy plan is we gather feedback from the families, right? We're doing observations in the classroom, looking at those dynamics. Maybe you send out surveys or questionnaires to the family or to the community to get their perceptions about your plan, to see if it's something that, went really well, or if there's some things you might need to adjust or work on. Then we look at what are some strategies for promoting inclusive practices, right? Easy to understand strategies for those who may not be versed in special needs, right, or in special education. So it's important for you to look at different materials that reflect different cultures and backgrounds. So when you're researching for these resources, right, in materials, some strategies to use when you're promoting special education and you're advocating for these children, make sure that it's adaptive activities for that specific child, and including those who have disabilities, and implementing those inclusive languages that we're looking at. And what are those teaching practices, right? That's going to support a child who has that certain disability. Now, how are you going to communicate and collaborate with the community and parents? So here's where you're going to have to do reflection. Discuss the importance of collaborating with families, right, and community members, and how you're advocating for inclusive practices. You're going to communicate that to them. What are you doing, right, to put that information out there to make them aware? Resources and support, you're really going to just list those resources available. Now, this could be nationwide resources. It could be ones within your community. Maybe even think about supportive networks, right, that advocate for inclusive practices, right? I know that organizations like NAEYC is an advocacy organization, right, because they focus on children, right, with exceptional needs, but also early childhood is the focus. So looking at those advocacy organizations, really diving deep into those local education advocacy groups that really stick up for those who have special needs, and the focus should be early childhood, right? You can also look at online forums, right, for community, for sharing ideas and resources. So really don't box yourself in. Really try to think outside the box when we're talking about support networks. And always with the plan, you need to have a timeline. So you need to implement a timeline. So this could be a simple timeline giving me a strategy and a plan and how long it takes you to do this and how are you going to monitor to make sure you're achieving your goals. And then lastly, you're going to conclude. So basically summarizing your plan and express your commitment to creating a more inclusive environment. So again, the advocacy plan is going to be underneath the play-based learning plan, and you'll just fill it in. Lastly is going to be your reflection and intentional practice. So it's important whenever you do any project like this, even if you are going into the classroom or not, for you to reflect upon your experience with this assignment. So I want to look at what you gained from this assignment. What were some insights gained? I want you to look at strategies moving forward for further development. And looking at the influence that this assignment had on your intentional and reflective practice. So I have some questions here that's really going, these prompts are really going to help guide your thinking and reflection. So you're going to answer these questions as part of your reflective practice. Now, I did put a little snippet here at the bottom, and hopefully by this point you've read through the entire assignment. But this is just an overview, kind of like a checklist, if you will, to make sure that the guidelines are in place and you're following based on the expectations for this project. So make sure you read through all the parts and you review the grading rubric. That's number one. Then really look at the persona, read over it again, the one you chose for your child, and then really conduct thorough research. Research is going to be your friend because there's lots of parts in here that's going to require you to research. You can use our textbook, you can use web pages, advocacy organizations like we mentioned. You could use, our book mentions many types of resources, Division of Exceptional Children. You could look on our database system. There's so many resources available to you. So I really encourage you to think about how much effort you're putting in this research. And then you're going to use critical thinking, right, and evidence-based reasoning. When we talk about evidence-based reasoning, these are things that you're getting from evidence-based strategies, coming from our textbook, things that are working, things from our module that's been used, and is making sure that we're supporting our child, our persona child. I do want the assignment in Word format. You do need to have a cover sheet with your name on it. It does need to have these parts below. I do want a continuing running document. So it all needs to be on one thing. I do not want 6 different sections turned into the Dropbox. So make sure it's one total running document. And make sure you label it just like this for each section. And again, if you scroll down, you're going to see those templates for those two activities that you're going to create, which is the play-based learning activity and the advocacy plan. If you scroll under that, you're going to see the rubric. I always tell students in my classroom, please make sure that you are reading the rubric at least twice. Once before you begin, and then second before you turn the assignment in. And you can even refer back to it as you're completing each section, but you're going to see here, I divided the rubric into the different parts that you're creating. So part 1, there's a section here. Part 2, and it lists the key competency and standard as well as what I want you to get. And here are the levels of achievement. One thing I wanted to note, and I mentioned this before, is that when you're looking at a rubric and you see where it says did not submit, that section means you didn't submit that part. That doesn't mean you didn't submit the whole paper, but if you didn't submit that part, you will not receive points for that section. Does not meet expectations. Read about why and what you only listed there. Okay, so what was missing? Progressing does not mean it's bad. It just means that maybe you've left something out, more critical thinking, maybe more progression is evident, maybe you didn't look at the challenging environmental impacts. So there's something there that was missing, but you're on your way. So don't think that progressing is bad. And then lastly is meets expectations. This is where you answered all the questions thoughtfully, with critical thinking is evident, you use research-based practices, so all of those components I asked for are met, and that's when you will earn meets expectations. And as you see here, I'll walk you through each part, through the rubric. Make sure that you look at that before you submit it. Alright, well that pretty much covers the last 2 parts. Please make sure that you do submit this and work on it. If you look here, and if you go to your Dropbox, it's also listed in our course calendar. It will tell you when it's due. So our Inclusive Practices Fieldwork is due on April 13th. So please make sure that you are not waiting to the last minute. As I mentioned in the beginning of the semester, this project is something you continually work on the entire semester. You cannot just work on it for 1 week and expect to get a really great grade on this. It's not going to happen. It's going to take a lot of time to really work through, and the research alone is going to take you time. So do not wait till the last minute. If you have questions, I'm free to meet with you in person or virtually, so please reach out. And until next time, take care.